better than this one or that one. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start. We looked at, and I've got that on the, I've got it on the sheet. We have to have tools. There are basically 4 tools, but there are 3 historical tools or classical tools for knowing truth, for proving truth. They tell you in the schools, they tell you in the colleges, it's totally bogus that you can't prove truth. If you can't prove truth, then airplanes can't fly. And they fly over my house all the time. If truth can't be proven, then cars can't run. But that's another problem. You can't create beautiful and really cool devices like this, nor computers. But how do you prove truth? And I told you, we have the scientific method, the legal historical method. If you need a refresher on any of those, we can. I think about a really short refresher. But I've got to talk about logic. Now, I know that you've been taught that you don't need to prove non-physical truths because we're all empiricists. Because during the age of empiricism, the age of what they call the age of reason, because the empiricists won in the age of reason, did they teach you this in school? This is really important truth. We are all supposed to be empiricists. The supernatural world doesn't exist, but does anyone have thoughts? Where do those thoughts come from? Are they just magical? Are they just chemical reactions in your brain? The scientists today are trying to prove that thoughts are just chemical reactions in your brain. Does anyone believe that? How about emotions? Are emotions just physical reactions of pheromones and DNA? And no one would, really, in the history of the ancient world, no one believed that or thinks that. Mathematics. Mathematics is not historical, cannot be proven by the historical legal method, cannot be proven with the scientific method at all, because it's not repeatable. It is immutable. It exists. Mathematics. Is mathematics real? Well, I'm an engineer, and I guarantee you if mathematics were not real, then you couldn't do these kind of things. We couldn't calculate the power be it necessary. Of course, some people say no one calculates correctly the air conditioning required for buildings and things like that, but you can, okay? So just so you know, you can. And buildings don't routinely fall down in the Western world because they're built to a factor of safety of 10. So I would conclude that mathematics is real. However, it's not physical. Mathematics is not physical. Can anyone write for me pi? Simply, can you do the dimension of the outside of a unit circle? Can you write that for me? I'll give you the time. It's called an irrational number. The Greeks knew about irrational numbers. There's also a number, the natural log. Anybody write the natural log out for me? Nobody knows about pi, or natural log as much about pi, but it's an engineering concept. The natural log is a critical number in the world, but it's an irrational number. Tell me, how can we have unreal numbers? Anybody know about unreal numbers? We actually use unreal numbers to prove things. Like, for example, I can do analyses of flows, of heat flow. And I use unreal numbers. You know what an unreal number is, right? Square root of -1. Okay, so you're saying you're boring me with this stuff. I don't know, maybe you've never heard this before. But the square root of -1, that's an unreal number. We represent it with I. I is the representation for the unreal number, the square root of -1. It is an impossible number. It is not possible, but yet it's used mathematically. can that be? Can you draw it? Well, I could give a symbol. I have a symbol. The problem with symbols, okay, you guys don't get it because you're lucky. We're so lucky. We grew up with Arabic numbers. Anybody want to try doing some mathematics in base 5? Of course, if you've never done hexadecimal code or anything like that, most people haven't. I've worked with hexadecimals, and I've worked with base 5 and base 2. You know, computers all work with base 2. That's all you do, right? If you didn't know. 0 and 1, that's all you got. 0 and 1, on and off. Okay, so how are you going to prove that stuff? Well, there is one way to prove this, and it's proven through logic. Logic is a mathematical science. Anybody heard of Boolean math? You know what Boolean math is, right? And or what's important about Boolean math? What do we use it for?
Programming.
Yeah, computer programming. If you don't know Boolean math, you're done. You can't program. Programming is all Boolean math. And if you go down, when I was young, we used to program in assembly code, pops and pokes. And I'm telling you what, today the programmers have it so easy because they ain't pops and pokes anymore. You know, you can do with one code what it takes a page of pops and pokes to do. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, but it's really important science. Most kids will have no clue at all about this really important stuff. Anyway, logic is a mathematical science. Math is the way and the means use it. Math is the beginning and the construct for all logic. So here's a basic logic. You've heard this. I know you've heard this. As a matter of fact, let's see if we make this go. Does anybody remember geometry or trigonometry? Trigonometry. All right. In trigonometry and in geometry, what were you introduced to in geometry that you carried on to trigonometry? What was it that they taught you from the beginning of the first class? Does anyone remember? Now it's trigonometry. Proofs. Don't you remember those proofs? You've forgotten them because you hated them, right? I'm an engineer. I hate mathematical proofs. I had to take a high level, like 500 level math class in my engineering studies for my PhD. And you know what? That was the worst class ever for me because I just wanted to know, how can I solve the problems? I don't care how you prove that you're solving the problems, but let me tell you, okay, I'll give it to you. In mathematical proofs, the logic that we use to prove it, and we prove it, right? It's proven. There are proven mathematical postulates. Here's one. If A equals B, if A equals A, and A equals B, and B equals C, I don't know why I have an A equals A there. Anyway, then A equals C, right? If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. You can prove that in geometric, in math, beyond a shadow of a doubt. If someone tells you that's not true, what do you tell them? You're an idiot, because this is a proven geometric concept. There are all kinds of proven geometric and trigonometric concepts, right? You remember proving the angles, you did all that stuff, right? And you used radians and all, you proved beyond a shadow of a doubt certain mathematical concepts. Did you use the scientific method? No, you didn't repeat it. You didn't ask every kid in the class to repeat the proof and then average it out, right? The proof was a proof, and it was either right or wrong. If you did it wrong, you got a D, an F. Today in today's classes, if you got it wrong, they'll probably give you a participation, B. But if you got it right, you got an A because you got it right. Now, in Britain, you get a C, because C just means you got it.
A equals C.
But A equals C. Oh, that's good, that's good. So logic is the language we use in theology and philosophy. And logic is the method of theology and philosophy. And not just theology and philosophy. Logic is the means we use to prove mathematical proofs. It's the way we prove all kinds of radical things like thoughts, emotions. Like, for example, if you give a Matty face at me and you say, I'm not upset, what do I deduct? He might be upset, but he's not telling me the truth, right? Because why? Do people lie or not tell the exact truth? All the time. Go live in an Asian culture. I've told you before, it's just true here. If you have really bad breath and you go to, now if you go to your loved one and you ask your wife, do I have bad breath? What's she going to say? Oh yeah, you got really bad breath. Go and use your mouthwash. But if I go to a friend or a stranger or someone who I don't know very well and they say, do I have bad breath? Oh no, your breath smells like lilacs. Right? What do you deduce? Oh, I need to go use some mouthwash, right? Just saying. Logic is how we do that. And logic is one of the tools we will use in logic. This is what you always do. If you remember back to geometry, this is what they taught you. If you remember back to trigonometry, this is what they taught you. If you forgot all your math and never had another bit of math, then you don't remember this stuff. But this is all basic mathematics. You have definitions. A, B, C, equal, what is equal? You have assumptions, equality, set theory. You have arguments, A equals B and B equals C, and then you have a conclusion. You remember this little triangle thing? That indicates a conclusion. And if you were right, you get an A. If you're wrong, you get an F for a participation, medal, ribbon, and that's the way the world is. But this is how you do a logical argument. So, to do this, and I'm going to get into this today, we're going to do some things. We're going to do what's called constructs or paradigms, and we're going to bound the problems. So, you notice I gave you 3 tools. All these are historical tools. The Greeks invented them. The Greeks developed these tools, the scientific method, historical, legal method, and logic, reasoning, logic. And they follow specific rules. So we're going to have some assumptions in our class. I'm going to use some assumptions. I call them normative Christian Bible theology, although the woke Pope says that all ways lead to heaven. So don't trust the woke Pope. That's not what the rest of Christianity says. That's a real perversion of God's world and worldview. But if we have assumed some normative Christian Bible ideas, theology, and remember, theology is based in logic and reasoning. It's also based in some other stuff we'll talk about a little bit, but I do this in my classes where I do the studies in the Greek and the Bible and the Hebrew. So I'm not going to do that as much, and we'll talk about the constructs and the paradigms, and I'll try to explain what I mean. But, we can assume normative that God exists, and I'll make a comment on it in a second. God interacts with man, and God has revealed himself in the Old Testament and New Testament. The reason I call it the Old Testament and the New Testament documents is because, by the way, does anybody have a Bible with the Apocrypha in it? I do. When did they take the Apocrypha out of the Bible?
1835.
1826, but really good. That's good. Yeah, 1826, the Bible was removed, the Apocrypha was removed from the Bible. Every Bible until 1826 included the Apocrypha. Every Bible that Martin Luther had included the Apocrypha. Martin Luther is one of the reasons we lost the Apocrypha from the normal Bible, but that's a whole nother tale. He almost pulled out 2 Peter, James, Jude, Hebrews, and Revelation. He didn't like those 5 books. And we were going to lose those because of Marty, but we kept them because we didn't like Marty's conclusion. But anyway, the Apocrypha was pulled out of your Bible. So, I call the Old Testament New Testament documents because the Old Testament documents include the Apocrypha. And by the way, there are a whole bunch of other New Testament documents. I haven't taught a class on this in a while, but I do mention them in other classes. Anyway, but that's just kind of a side thing. But that's why I like to call them New Testament, Old Testament documents. There is an assumption of law in the Bible, especially from the Torah, and we will get into some of this, but there are also cultural language aspects. So, for example, what is the Old Testament written in? Hebrews and Aramaic. Hebrews is a live language today, but was a dead language during the time of Christ. What is the New Testament documents written in? Greek. So everybody whips out the Greek Bible, right? And you know your Greek and your Hebrew. King James. It was good enough for Paul and Silas. It's good enough for me, right? Yeah. You got a problem. And which Bible you want to pick? German? I've got a copy of the German Bible. I've got a copy of the French Bible. The German Bible is translated by Martin Luther. And I've got King James, too. But there's New King James and Old King James and NIV, but the Greek is what you want, majority of text. So anyway, there are cultural aspects, language aspects. We're going to assume the validity of certain aspects in our discussion. And the validity are basically about the scientific method, legal, historical method, which I described to you, and logic itself. Everything else is kind of free game. So let me do this. Let's move over to what I wanted to cover specifically in this class, and that is right here. I'll make the view properly so you see it. And here's what I want to talk about. We have our tools. That's on your thing, on your paper. We have the tools, but we have to use what are called constructs or paradigms. Constructs or paradigms. Let me go. Let's see. This is just the intro. There we go. How do you know what's true in the physical world? We talked about historical method and scientific method. How do you know what's true in non-physical constructs? I'm starting to use those: mathematics and non-physical world, thought, emotions, logical arguments. And then here's an interesting point we're going to move through here, because it's called Einstein's paradox. And I mentioned Einstein's paradox last week. Here's a real problem that Einstein had. It doesn't bother us, but Einstein's paradox is this: creation is defined by the scientific method and the legal historical method. Undergirding the creation is probability. Probability, the Heisenberg equations. Like I said, how do I know where the electron is? I know. The electron around every atom. Do you hear me? Around every atom can be anywhere in the universe. The probability says that it will be in a certain sphere around, and it's possibly in the middle, which is impossible, right? Because it's negative, and the proton, let's say of a hydrogen atom, is positive. You can't have negative and positive, right? But Heisenberg says it is probable. So this is Einstein's problem. Einstein did not know anything about chaos math, but he knew probability. He's one of the guys who helped put together the idea of Heisenberg is the guy, but Einstein used Heisenberg's equations and ideas about probability. And he made the comment, he said, I don't believe God rolls dice. But yet probability shows that God, well, it wasn't God rolling dice, because if we look at the cosmos, we look at the undergirding of everything, this is one of the assumptions we make. If you're going to have a God, what does your God have to be? Can he be imperfect? No. As a matter of fact, if any of the constants if the gravitational constant, and I'm not talking about gravity as in little g, I'm talking about the gravity, what is it, m? Big M is the gravitational constant. If the gravitational constant is off by 0.00001, what happens to the whole universe? Yeah, it implodes. It's gone. It's done. If there are constants in the universe, then if the constants are off by just a hair, as a matter of fact, some modern physicists have used this concept to prove the existence of God. Although they didn't have to, Immanuel Kant did in philosophy, so you're too late. If you want to disprove the existence of the not God, we'll talk about this as we move through. But the big deal is that undergirding the cosmos is God. God created, right? And God is perfect. God's like math. God's not like the scientific method that I'm, doing an experiment and getting a sig fig and getting a curve. Yeah, what do you call it? Getting a statistical sigma, right? God's not like that. God is like exact mathematics. But there is chaos. Chaos isn't what you think. I don't care what you read in what's that dumb book, the ones about the dinosaurs coming back through DNA. That was Michael Crichton, right? Michael Crichton's books. Yeah, Jurassic Park. Michael Crichton was wrong. If you read that, he talks about chaos math. Chaos math is where if a butterfly flaps its wings in China, it causes a hurricane. No, that's not chaos math. Chaos math tells us that we can see order even in the most disordered systems. So in other words, probability, if I'm taking a putt at 10 feet, probability says that I might miss. Chaos math says I might not miss. Chaos math is very interesting because chaos math is not based in probability. So if you look at this, it's very interesting. Undergirding the physical creation used to be perfect as God is perfect. God is the same, predictable, formed by immutable laws like pure mathematics. But yet we have a created physical universe that follows the basic laws, but it's ungirded by chaos and probability. So where do you think that chaos and probability, where do you think the probability came from? How about the fall? Probability came from the fall. If the universe was created perfectly, and all of a sudden there's something interjected into it that makes it unpredictable, what do we call that? That's sin. On the other hand, there's a thing called chaos math. Now, who in their right mind would overlay probability, uncertainty, with chaos math that brings it back into perfection? Now, I'm just giving you a very simple example, but what this example is supposed to show you is that when we take our reasoning tools and we look at the universe, we look at the way the world is, you can immediately begin to see truths, right, within the fabric of what we study and know. And, this is what we call looking at it in constructs. What construct was Einstein looking at the world in? Einstein was a Jewish guy, right?
Did he believe in God?
Yes, he did. And he wasn't a strong Jewish guy, but he studied and knew the Torah. He knew the Tanakh. He knew the Old Testament documents. That's the reason he said, I don't believe God throws dice. What part of the God picture did he not have? The salvation part, the other part. So my point is simply this. I'm not trying to, you can draw a lot. I think you can draw a lot from this. But I'm trying to show you how these tools can be used. Now, we didn't make a explicit proof. I'm just taking stuff. I'm not proving it too explicitly. But you can see that there's some really complex stuff that you can look at just using, you take the world, the physical world as it is, the scientific method, legal historical method, and then what do? I put some reason into it, some logic and reasoning, and if we did a whole formal proof of this Einstein paradox, what would we have? Like a book, right? So we're not going to take time to do a whole book, but I just wanted you to see the power that's possible in these tools and using these tools. Now, here's a really important point. This is why you can never win an argument. Okay? This is absolutely why you can't win an argument. The reason is because there are things called paradigms or constructs. I'm going to mention a couple. I'm not going to prove them. I proved these top two, which I listed as religious constructs in class. And I actually have taught a class before. I can prove to you beyond a shadow of a doubt why, for example, the Quran, the Book of Mormon, the Book of Japan, the Shinto documents, the Buddhist documents, there are a lot of Zoroastrianism. There's a lot of ancient documents that purport to be true history or true information. Anybody read some of them? Anybody read Zoroastrian, maybe Hammurabi Code? Hammurabi Code, if you do anything, you die. But, that's a great code of laws, right? You die. But if you ever read Hammurabi, it's pretty funny. The Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Hinduism, all those documents, maybe you read the Bhagavad Gita or one of the Gitas. The Gitas are really interesting in themselves. The problem is that when you try to prove them using the historical method, however, and I do it all the time, I prove using the historical method, the historical legal method, the New Testament documents all the time. It's easy to prove. It's a lot easier than all the other documents in antiquity. I can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that other documents that are religious documents are not authentic. So I know you're going to have to trust me with this, but I'm going to assert that what we call Torah Law Old Testament, although it's harder to do, is a construct that is a valid construct. Now the problem you have is, what's the problem you have with the New Testament and Old Testament documents in these constructs? What's the big problem with it? Well, usually our approach, and by the way, it's really funny. If you go to Fringe University, you go to most secular universities, what will they use as their document, their main document for New Testament era studies? Josephus. Josephus is provable, easily provable, is not a good historical source. It's a tertiary source. The New Testament has primary and secondary document sources. Why wouldn't you use the New Testament? There's a presumption that they're religious documents. Well, they are religious-ish documents. They're historical documents. But a lot of secular universities won't use them because they'd rather pick a tertiary, terrible document. Josephus is okay, but, and by the way, he supports a lot of the biblical information. But the problem with Josephus is he's not a good historical source. He wrote it, he never saw the events he wrote about. He was paid by the Romans to write it. He wrote it in Greek, which wasn't his primary language, which is okay too, that we know of. But Josephus, is not a great source, but yet it's used in teaching the New Testament era in almost every school in America, every secular university. from friends to Newman. And those aren't supposed to be secular, are they? And Harvard wasn't supposed to be secular either, but it's about as secular as you get. Anyway, my point is this. If you try to use, this is why you're going to lose every argument using the Old Testament and New Testament. Because if I have a crowd that I have convinced or is convinced about the accuracy of those documents, am I in good shape? Yeah. But if I haven't, what are they going to say?
It's no better than Buddha or
Yeah.
documents.
You believe in that, why don't you believe in the Bhagavad Gita? If you believe in the New Testament, why don't you believe in the Hindu, the Shinto, or Zoroastrian, or whatever, or even Taoism? Why don't you believe in that stuff? Well, I can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt why you don't. However, it's not a bumper sticker. It's not a bumper sticker, so you're going to lose every argument. You're going to lose every argument unless you stick in the construct. In other words, if I try to prove something within the Old Testament or New Testament, I can do pretty well if I'm arguing points with somebody and I stick to the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? The problem is, you got another problem. I'm going to bring this up really quickly. I already mentioned it. What language are they written in? Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. So if I got somebody arguing in English about a Greek document, what's going to happen?
Lack of understanding.
Total lack of understanding. How about culturally? Culturally is something we touch all the time in the John class and Hebrew classes. Oh, baby, if you don't understand the culture, you're done. Do not go to Germany and say, "Ich bin warm." That means you're excited. Say, "Es ist mir warm." I'm too warm. I'm too hot. That's what you say because one is culturally unacceptable, one is culturally correct. If you just, I'm telling you, make sure in your German classes you get the right information from your teacher because you could really look back. This is true of all cultures, all languages. So, anyway, now, if we move to science, science is all about the scientific method. In science, we use the historical legal method. How do we use the historical legal method in science? We write down our results in papers, right? You write down your results. You've seen scientific papers. I've written a lot of scientific papers. I've written about 70, almost 100 scientific papers. Scientific papers, you write the paper, you prove your points, you have references, you use the scientific method, the legal historical method for data. You have your data. And if you stick in the scientific, in science as a paradigm or construct, okay, you should be speaking only about what? Data, the things that can be repeated and the data I have for repeatable stuff, right? So if I take a paper that has no statistical correlation and the statistics are terrible with no data and there's no other papers that can prove that point and you can't do the experiments and get the same repeatable results, what is that?
Not publishable.
It's supposed to be not publishable. It's garbage. It's trash. In science, if we stay in the scientific paradigm, we're great. Scientific paradigm means I have hard data, hard facts, hard information. I'll mention this because it's really bothersome to me as a scientist, but one of the biggest problems in the modern era is we have moved way out of science, baby, into all kinds of non-scientific belief structure, especially for, AGW, anthropometric global warming, anthropomorphic global warming caused by human beings. I can prove in a very short period of time why it's impossible, but yes, sir.
They have consensus.
You know what?
All agree that's right.
I've read
Everybody who agrees.
those papers, and there is no consensus. There is no scientist in the world who has written in his paper, therefore I conclude there is global warming to a certain degree. Because you can't write that in the scientific method based on repeatable events, because the experiments are, how many experiments have proven global warming? Zero. What they have proven, or what they have not proven, what they have shown is they have simulations. They run simulations, and the simulations, how accurate are these simulations? Well, the problem with the simulations is, when was the ice pack supposed to be totally not existent? Well, they predict in 1981 that in 1990 there'd be no more ice. There'd be no more ice in the ice caps. Is there ice in the ice caps?
Yes.
Matter of fact, last year the ice in the ice caps was higher than it's ever been noted in history, and in Antarctica they can't explain why it's not decreasing. But data is data, okay? And I'm just saying there's a huge propensity in the modern era to go away from data. And if you haven't noticed this, for example, how many sexes are there? There's male and female. XY and XX. That's chromosome. Easy to measure, easy to know. How many genders are there?
Still counting.
Still counting.
Well, really, their gender, I used to have a teacher, this really wise teacher, and every time he said the gender of the rabbit is male or female, she would say, gender is for nouns and verbs. Sex is for humans and animals. In other words, nouns and verbs have gender. Masculine, feminine, neutrum, right? German. Anybody studied a foreign language? Foreign languages, right? You know, foreign language, German, English. We used to have gendered nouns. I don't think we ever had gendered verbs, except the Anglo-Saxons did. But Greek has gendered nouns, gendered verbs, gendered everything. And they're mostly feminine and masculine. Neutrum, is really not existent in a lot of ancient languages. It popped up in German, das, right? Dirty das, you've heard of dirty das. And in Spanish. So gender is for nouns and verbs, not for animals, people, okay? Anyway, if a scientist looks you in the eye and tells you something about gender, what should you do? Laugh and turn around, because you can't be a scientist. That's impossible. Just saying. You see, if we stick in the science construct, there's a whole bunch of really cool stuff we can prove, but you can't be moving out of that construct. What does it mean when you move out of the science construct to an opinion construct? What have you just done? Like,
Move from facts to feelings.
yeah, if I go to opinion, I suddenly move to feelings. And even the Old Testament, New Testament isn't about feelings, right? It's about the language. It's about what does it say. So, you know, I can move. If somebody moves, you're arguing in a science construct, and somebody moves into a Torah or a New Testament construct, now you're switching constructs or paradigms. How are you going to come to an answer? This is like reading a scientific paper and suddenly someone says, and Gaia is the goddess of the earth. And you go, This isn't a scientific paper all of a sudden, right? Just saying. Now, let's look at this one, man's law. Man's law is very interesting. We can do a lot with man's law, but what's the problem with man's law? Anybody remember? From the class before, remember? What's the problem with man's law? I can make anything in man's law. Did you know in Nazi Germany, it was okay to murder Jewish people, to murder people who were retarded, to murder people who were sick and ill. They practiced a mandatory euthanasia. It's documented. They even made movies, cool propaganda movies about it in German that you can still find probably on the internet. But the Germans made laws. They said they can incarcerate people that looked Jewish or even were Jewish or looked Romanian, looked like they were Romish.
Kansas enshrined abortion as a legal constitutional right.
You can make anything in God's law. So if in man's law. I'm sorry, God's law is something else. That's Torah and New Testament. We'll just touch on that in other classes. But man's law can be anything. The problem you have in arguing in the man's law construct is what? Man's law. It could be anything.
Madison says that man is not an angel.
And he's right on the money. Of course, modern theology, what do they call it? What kind of theology? The idea that people are inherently good, which is exactly opposite of what is taught in the New Testament and the Old Testament, right? The Old Testament and the New Testament, now we incorporate or encapsulate the idea of sin, of original sin, right? Original sin. We presume that human beings are naturally not good. Probability. Therefore, God had to put chaos math over the top to enable us to have any kind of goodness. Just kind of reference to what we were talking about. But the big deal is this, that when you look at man's law, you can look at legal historical and data, that is historical data, but you got to be really cautious in arguing in the construct of man's law, because like I said, pull up, now, who's to say that Nazi Germany's law was not totally good and legal? It was totally legal.
God.
I agree. You have to look at another construct and then apply it, right? You have to apply it within that construct and say, is this, but you have to step outside the construct. So you see how you're never going to win an argument in man's law, ever. You're never going to win it. You can't, because it's impossible. It's anything. Now, history is different. History is really different. History may be the most powerful method method that we have other than science. The reason for that is because history is supposed to be immutable. History is based in the legal historical method. Legal historical method is based in data alone. So how do I know something is true historically? Eyewitness accounts, secondary accounts. You can pull up some tertiary accounts, but guess what? I told you before, what are secondary accounts called? Hearsay. What are tertiary accounts?
Inadmissible.
They're inadmissible in a court of law, right? Now, the problem with history, especially ancient history, what is the big problem with ancient history? The amount of sources. So what I have to do is I have to take so what is probably the worst thing that you could do in the whole world forever and ever with any historical source, especially if it's eyewitness or a secondary witness? Toss it out. Pliny the Younger, Josephus. There are 3 copies of Pliny. They're all 1,000 years old. If you remember the other classes, we talked about this, but they're 1,000 years from the time they're written. How accurate are they? No way to know. But I got the New Testament. There's 25,000 copies of the New Testament documents. Most of them come from really early periods and in the original tongue, original language, and I can correlate those. So why would you teach a class in the first century using Josephus, which is a terrible source? Although I do have 50 copies of Josephus' Wars. I think I have 75 of the history of the Jews. But he never saw any of it. He was writing down stuff that he'd never seen before, right? Just saying, like I said, I looked at these before. But the point about history is, history, like science, science is scientific method with historical method for recording the events. History is legal historical method. And by the way, I can use some scientific method tools to help prove history. I know people do not like, for some reason, the churches, look, I'm just a scientist. I just use whatever tool I got, right? But you have a carbon dating. And I'm not sure why people are so upset about carbon dating or radioactive dating, because guess what? You can really use it really well. Did you hear about the Shroud of Turin? The latest on the Shroud of Turin? They actually used some really high-end carbon dating, and they have dated the Shroud of Turin into the first century. Now that should make every Christian go, yeah, baby, right? Because what I've done is I've used historical data to support archaeological data. Now, is the Shroud of Turin really the shroud that Christ, that was over Christ? Did it form a miraculous thing? I don't know. They haven't found any paint. They haven't found any evidence that it isn't. It is a great historical piece. Archcode documents. I love the Archcode documents. Most people have never heard of the Archcode documents. Archcode documents are buried in the Vatican. We have copies. We know what they are because this preacher from America had heard about them, went to the Vatican, asked for them, got them, made copies, and then published them, translations of them. And guess what happened to the documents? They disappeared into the vaults because the Vatican may have only 1 or 2 copies of those documents. So they're not really good historical documents. We don't know if they're pseudographia. We don't know if they're anagraphia. We don't know what kind of documents they are, really, because you have to look at the documents. But guess what? Compared to other historical documents, they're pretty darn good. A lot of historical documents, we have 1 copy, maybe 3 copies, like I said, of plenty. If you have 1 copy, how do you know? You have no idea. You have to have multiple copies to be able to make some of these decisions. However, if I have 1 copy of 1 document in antiquity, what do you usually do? Give the benefit of the doubt to the document. Unless you have another document that obviously contradicts. This is a problem with books of works in antiquity. There are no contradictory documents. When we look at the New Testament, we look at this all the time. I try to bring out all the documents from the period so you can see it. But the thing in history is, you should be able to argue in history and win arguments in history as long as you stay in the construct. How do we know that's true about science and history? It's easily provable. How do we know? Papers, scientific papers. If you have a scientific paper, especially in science, right, with data and statistical data and the experiments, what should that do? That should be a really good source, especially if it's peer reviewed. And then what do you do as a scientist? You try to repeat the experiment. And if I have, let's say I have 10 papers that all say, hey, we tried this experiment, it worked, it's true. Then you go, it's true, it's science. Every kid in America is doing a stupid drop the ball for gravity. So Newton was right, and Newton had also invented integral and differential calculus. So you could blame him for it. But no, Newton is the best of the best. And by the way, he was a very strong Christian fellow. But
What would you say on the history? You know, there's a saying about the winner writes the history. So if there are countering accounts that are basically wiped out and they lost, does that take away from some of the historical writings or strength of it?
not at all, because the people who wrote that the victors write the histories are trying to sell you history books. And remember, I told you, in history, we have primary sources, we have secondary, and we have tertiary. And then we have none. I call it quaternary, but it's none. Okay, none is opinion. All the opinion pieces that are written in America every day in the papers, they have no value. None at all. However, if it's a primary source document, an eyewitness account, if it's a newspaper article or a secondary account, if it's a history book, history books are not even allowed in most historical papers. If you're going to write a historical paper on Civil War, what do you get?
Letters, original documents.
Letters, diaries, the original documents from the period, right? War plans. How much opinion, how much victor opinion is written in those documents? Zero. There is no opinion in an eyewitness, in a letter that was written by, let's say, a slave owner to their child, which is really rare. Only 8% of the people in the South owned slaves, but pretty rare anyway. But the writing of, let's say, a farmer to his child in battle fighting at Gettysburg with Lee, or a letter from a northern, person writing to their kid at a battle or an area. Those are all historical sources. The eyewitness, when I wrote a book on the Civil War, when I wrote it, I got all historical sources, first and second sources. Most of it was primary. It was diaries, it was letters, because I did not want to taint my understanding for my historical fiction with opinions of people, right? That's how we do it. And so, like I said, people who said that are trying to sell you a history book. Wink, wink, nod, nod, right? When we look at culture, culture is really important because culture is historical also. Culture is historical. Why? Culture. What is historical about culture? An historical method. Because I write down cultural things. For example, this. Here's a cultural document. If somebody wanted to study, this is also a historical document, it's a cultural document. So if somebody wanted to study classes that were taught in this year in America, right? They could pull this, or they could pull my notes, and they could say, well, this is cultural document and information. Now, is it opinion? Is it truth? What is it? Well, the truth in it is what is historically documented, right? So in a paper, if I wrote a paper about this information, then I would write that information. I might even take the videotapes and do a synopsis of what was taught. That is historically true. It's also culturally true because it shows it when you teach a class at this church and maybe at more than this church. What do you have? We have people, you have some type of audiovisual devices, you have notes, you have maybe cheat sheets like I give. My class likes to have a place to write, right? So you have this cultural information and you put it down. Now that doesn't tell you about the accuracy necessarily of the class or any of that, but it tells you culturally, how do people act? How do people live? Even the language that we're using right now. We're not speaking Elizabethan English, or we're not speaking Monty Python, right? We're speaking American English with a Midwest maybe twang. and maybe some cultural stuff. Where's the beef? Right? Understand that? Understand. Anyway, the point is that culturally, things are historical, legal also. And if you stick in a cultural argument, you can win a cultural argument because it's about history. But what I'm warning you about is this is why you never won the argument that you thought you could win, right? You thought, I have all the data, I have all the information. You're trying to stick in, let's say, a historical construct, and what happened? The person you're arguing with does what? They jump into a biblical construct, a religious construct. Well, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. Or they jumped into, you're talking in a science construct, and they jump into a historical construct or a cultural concept. That's not how we do it here. That's not the way America is. Well, how is America? Right? You see what I'm saying? You can't win an argument if you skip constructs. So what we'll do is when we look at the arguments, and next time we'll look at, well, I'm going to talk about harm next as a concept. But the big deal that we'll do is we're going to look at first the, I'm going to talk about harm, but then we're going to look at, where is it? Next week. Next week will be life issues. We'll look at medical issues, life issues, health issues. We're going to look at science in terms of those issues, and we're going to stick in the science construct and see what science says about certain things and what we can prove and disprove easily in health issues. So thank you, Father, for your word of prayer. Look after us this week. In your name we pray.
Okay, Len, before computers figured out distances in outer space,
Yeah.
there was a theorem 8